The story of King Henry VIII, a monarch of legend, scandal, and 6 thoroughly unforgettable marriages, begins not with a crown or a coronation, but with a baby. A baby born on a chilly June day in 1491, when England was still brushing the dust off its Civil War boots and trying to remember how to be a peaceful kingdom again. This child, squirming in royal linen and already inheriting centuries of political baggage, was Henry Tudor. He entered the world with a birthright he wasn't even supposed to need, and perhaps, as legend would have it, with a smirk already gracing his chubby little face. Henry was the second son of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York, 2 royals brought together not by passion, but by the sharp necessity of peace. Their union was meant to stitch together a kingdom frayed by decades of dynastic feuds, the infamous Wars of the Roses. Henry VII, somber, tight-lipped, and endlessly cautious, had taken the throne after winning the Battle of Bosworth, defeating Richard III, and ending Plantagenet rule. His victory marked the dawn of the Tudor era, and with it came a new vision for England, one centered on control, caution, and consolidation. Into that vision, young Henry was born. As the second son, Henry wasn't expected to be king. That role was reserved for his older brother, Arthur, the golden child of Tudor PR, named with deliberate symbolism to evoke the legendary King Arthur and reinforce the narrative of a noble, mystical England reborn. Arthur was groomed for kingship from the cradle, receiving every academic, courtly, and diplomatic advantage the crown could bestow. In contrast, young Henry's path was that of the spare heir, still royal but always second, destined perhaps for the church or high nobility, but not the throne. But fate has always enjoyed irony. Arthur, despite his careful upbringing and politically significant marriage to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, died suddenly in 1502 at the tender age of 15. Some say it was tuberculosis. Others blame the damp English climate, the stress of royal expectations, or simply the fragility of Tudor health. Whatever the reason, Arthur's death left a vacuum, and into it stepped young Henry, now unexpectedly heir to the English throne and, awkwardly, the proposed new husband of his late brother's widow. Yes, that's right, Henry would eventually inherit not just Arthur's title but also his wife. A foreshadowing of his later tendencies, perhaps. But let's not rush to the marriages and mayhem just yet. First, let's properly meet the man behind the myth. Henry was tall, over 6 feet, which in Tudor times was practically towering. He had the physique of a warrior king, broad-shouldered, athletic, and built like someone who actually enjoyed all the jousting, hunting, and swordplay expected of noblemen. His hair was a rich auburn, often described as thick and glossy, and his piercing blue eyes were both captivating and intimidating, windows into a mind that was as quick to love as it was to condemn. From a young age, Henry dazzled. He was not only physically impressive but also frighteningly intelligent. He was educated in Latin, French, philosophy, music, theology, and more, his mind a sponge for knowledge and power alike. He played instruments with skill, composed music, wrote poetry, engaged in theological debates with clerics, and even showed a flair for academic writing. In another life, he might have been a scholar or a composer. But in this life, he was destined to rule. And rule he would, with a flair that few monarchs before or after him could match. His childhood, though privileged, was not without emotional complexity. He was kept away from the center of power, largely in the shadow of Arthur, raised by women of the court and private tutors who instilled in him a deep sense of entitlement and destiny. When Arthur died and Henry was suddenly the heir, the world shifted beneath his feet. Gone was the lesser son, now, he was the future of the Tudor dynasty. The crown was his eventual inheritance, and he embraced it like a boy grabbing a sword for the first time, eagerly, recklessly, and with more enthusiasm than understanding. In 1509, at just 17 years old, Henry ascended the throne after the death of his father. His coronation was a glittering spectacle of youth, pageantry, and political promise. England had grown tired of Henry VII's grey austerity and cautious paranoia. Now it had a vibrant, energetic new king, handsome, athletic, charming, and, for the moment, beloved. So what did this promising young ruler do first? Launch a new campaign of justice? Reform the tax code? Declare peace? Not quite. He married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, 5 years his senior, and a woman of formidable intelligence, devotion, and dignity. It was a politically convenient union, reaffirming the Anglo-Spanish alliance that Henry VII had worked hard to secure. And young Henry, idealistic and still unspoiled by the cynicism of power, genuinely seemed to care for her. At first, Henry VIII was everything England hoped he would be. He was generous, chivalric, and completely enthralled by the pomp and romance of kingship. He revived tournaments, threw lavish feasts, and transformed the royal court into a stage of constant entertainment and political theater. Picture roast swans served beneath golden arches, fountains flowing with wine, and costumes so elaborately velvet they looked like Renaissance boy bands gone wild. He loved music, not just passively, but as a composer and performer. One of his most famous pieces, Pastime with Good Company, captured the essence of his early reign: celebration, friendship, and the pursuit of pleasure. His court was alive with art, laughter, and ambition. He also loved sports. Jousting wasn't just a pastime, it was a performance of power, masculinity, and divine right. Hunting became a metaphor for conquest. Tennis, the real, obscure Tudor version, was a royal obsession. In many ways, Henry was England's original gym rat, with a scepter in one hand and a massive ego in the other. But beneath the splendor, darker traits simmered. Henry was raised in a world where kings were God's chosen. He absorbed that doctrine with terrifying sincerity. To disagree with him wasn't just treason, it was heresy. His religious devotion, intense from the start, only fueled his belief in his own infallibility. Early in his reign, he even wrote a blistering rebuttal to Martin Luther's Protestant critiques, earning the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope himself. Of course, history loves irony. That same title would be cast aside when Henry's desires later collided with doctrine, and Henry, not God, would become the head of England's church. By his mid-30s, cracks had begun to form in the golden facade. Though still powerful, still magnetic, Henry's temperament had begun to shift. He was increasingly irritable, suspicious, and prone to authoritarian whims. The man who once danced and debated now ruled with threats and fear. And yet, he remained convinced always that he was righteous. That his decisions were not merely legal but sacred. And so, as time passed, the Golden Boy transformed into something more formidable and more dangerous. So who, truly, was Henry VIII? He was a boy never meant to reign, thrust into power by death and necessity. A prince who started as the embodiment of Renaissance ideals, brilliant, charismatic, well-rounded, and who slowly, irrevocably, succumbed to the crushing weight of power, legacy, and expectation. He craved glory, demanded loyalty, and hungered for a son with a desperation that would undo lives and transform a kingdom. He loved music, theology, hunting, and women, but not with consistency or gentleness. He believed himself chosen, even when his choices tore families apart, reshaped religions, and rewrote national identity. He didn't just reign, he reinvented England in his own conflicted image. And at the heart of his legend, of course, were 6 women, 6 wives, each bound to him by love, duty, ambition, or fate. Their stories have been reduced to a chilling rhyme. Divorced. Beheaded. Died. Divorced. Beheaded. Survived. It's catchy, yes, but dangerously reductive. Behind that rhyme are real lives, brilliant, complex, and often heartbreaking. These women weren't just wives. They were queens, diplomats, mothers, survivors, martyrs, and legends in their own right. And through them, we understand not only Henry, but the kingdom he left behind. So now, dear dreamer, as the velvet drapes rise and the candlelight flickers through the corridors of time, let us step softly into their world. 6 stories await, each one a universe of love, betrayal, politics, and power. Let us begin with the first queen, the proud lioness who would not surrender her crown, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, the original queen, the lion-hearted consort, and perhaps the most dignified casualty of Henry's ever-shifting ambitions, did not arrive in England as a footnote to another woman's tragedy. She came cloaked in purpose, destined for greatness, born beneath the banners of Catholic conquest and Spanish royalty. The year was 1485, and Europe was aflame with the zeal of religion, empire, and dynastic pride. In the powerful courts of Spain, a child named Catalina de Aragon was born to 2 of the most consequential monarchs in Christendom, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. These were the same Catholic monarchs who had completed the Reconquista, expelled the Moors, financed Columbus, and fashioned Spain into the iron fist of Catholic Europe. Their daughter would carry that same sense of fire and righteousness in her bones. From the moment she could toddle across marble floors, Catherine's life was crafted for majesty. She studied languages, scripture, history, and philosophy under the finest tutors of the realm. She could debate theology before she could ride a horse, though ride she could, galloping across palace courtyards with the grace of a knight. She was not merely decorative, she was forged for rule. And she was devout, so devout that even her childhood prayers carried the weight of national destiny. Spain wasn't just religious, it was immersed in crusader mentality. Catherine grew up believing her life belonged to God and to whatever throne he saw fit to place beneath her. At 15, she left her warm Iberian world behind and crossed the cold, damp sea to England, betrothed to Prince Arthur, the hope of the Tudor dynasty. The wedding was a diplomatic spectacle, Spanish silk met English steel, and the union was hailed as a powerful bridge between 2 rising kingdoms. But tragedy struck before any roots could grow. Just 5 months after their wedding, Arthur died, whether from illness, England's notorious weather, or the sheer stress of being a teenage royal is unclear. What's certain is that Catherine, now a widow in a foreign land, found herself politically and personally adrift. With her dowry contested, her future in limbo, and her status as a virgin widow becoming a theological and diplomatic puzzle, Catherine was suddenly no longer a celebrated princess but an uncomfortable question mark. She claimed then and always that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a detail that would prove to be the pivot upon which the fate of nations would later turn. For 7 years she waited in England, surviving in a sort of royal purgatory. No longer a bride, not yet a queen, she lived with a reduced household and a reputation that flickered uncertainly between respect and irrelevance. And then came Henry. When Henry VII died in 1509 and the young, athletic, gold-locked Henry VIII ascended the throne, one of his first acts as king was to marry Catherine. She was 5 years his senior, but beautiful in a refined, regal way. Their marriage was more than a continuation of his father's alliance, it seemed, at first, like a union of genuine affection. For a time, they were England's golden couple. Catherine spoke fluent English, navigated courtly ceremony with grace, and was genuinely loved by the people. She was not just a foreign princess imported for diplomacy, she was Queen of England in every sense of the word. She ruled when Henry was away at war, even while heavily pregnant. In 1513, acting as regent, she presided over England's military victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. It was an extraordinary moment, a queen not only holding the crown but defending it with strength and poise. In her letter to Henry announcing the victory, she enclosed the blood-stained coat of the defeated Scottish king. That was Catherine, loyal, fierce, and utterly regal. But behind the royal victories and the public adoration, a shadow loomed. Henry wanted a son. Catherine endured at least 6 pregnancies, perhaps more, but only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary. The loss of so many children must have carved invisible scars into her soul, but she remained steadfast, believing, with every fiber of her devout heart, that her fate was God's will. Henry, however, grew restless. Obsessed with the notion that his lack of male heirs was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow, a marriage he himself had once zealously advocated, he began twisting scripture to suit his growing desperation. And into this tension stepped in Boleyn. And, witty, sharp, alluring, refused to be a mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her queen. And so, seduced by and driven by his need for a male heir, Henry sought a divorce from Catherine. Catherine refused. With every ounce of dignity, every sliver of power she had, she fought him. She argued her case in court. She stood before bishops and nobles and declared herself Henry's rightful wife. She even appealed directly to the Pope, leveraging her royal blood and Spanish ties. But perhaps her most iconic moment came when she knelt before Henry and declared, "I have been your wife in law and in conscience. And if it were not to the displeasure of God, I would rather be buried than put away." But Henry had made up his mind. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry turned his frustration into revolution. He broke from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and rewrote the religious structure of his entire nation, all so he could rid himself of the woman he once called beloved. Catherine was stripped of her title, banished from court, and cruelly separated from her daughter Mary. She lived the rest of her days in increasingly bleak castles, watched by spies, her every move restricted. And yet, she never wavered. She refused to acknowledge the annulment, continued to sign her letters as Queen of England, and insisted to the end that she was Henry's lawful wife. She died in 1536, at the age of 50, her heart said to be blackened when it was examined, a detail that spawned rumors of poison but which more poetically speaks of a life lived in sorrow and unbroken resolve. Catherine was faith embodied. Faith in God. Faith in her daughter. Faith in the crown. She lost her position, her power, even her family, but never her dignity. The English people loved her, even as she was cast aside. And though her daughter Mary would one day take the throne in a reign marked by fire and controversy, it was Catherine's example of queenly courage and religious conviction that blazed in her daughter's heart. Where Catherine stood firm, and Boleyn soared and fell. And was born in the lush countryside of Kent, into a family of ambition if not of royal rank. Her exact birth year is debated, 1501 or perhaps 1507, but the more relevant fact is this: and Boleyn was destined not for quiet submission, but for history-shaking disruption. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a shrewd diplomat with sharp elbows in court. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of England's most respected noble families. Together, they gave Anne a foundation of aspiration. She was sent abroad at a young age, living first in the Netherlands at the court of Archduchess Margaret and later in France under Queen Claude. There, she absorbed not just languages and etiquette but the art of courtly love, Renaissance thought, and the intoxicating charm of flirtation with power. By the time Anne returned to England, she was not the typical demure lady-in-waiting. Her olive skin, dark eyes, and famously elegant neck made her striking. But it was her mind that made her unforgettable. She was witty, articulate, and unafraid to challenge men, qualities that both fascinated and frightened. Henry VIII was entranced. She was not like her sister Mary, who had been one of his many mistresses, and would not be conquered. She made it clear, no ring, no romance. Henry began writing her passionate love letters, 17 survive to this day, filled with longing, jealousy, and promises. For Anne, this was her opportunity to rise not just into royal favor, but onto the throne itself. Henry's obsession grew. He appealed to the Pope for an annulment from Catherine, citing biblical passages and divine displeasure. But the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused. So Henry did what only Henry would do: he made his own church. In 1533, Anne and Henry were secretly married. Soon after, Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She was visibly pregnant, glowing in golden robes, reveling in a triumph she had schemed and waited years to claim. That autumn, she gave birth not to the long-awaited male heir, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was furious. He had torn apart his marriage, his church, and his country for Anne, and now, no son. His disappointment was palpable, and Anne's power began to crack. Her sharp tongue, once seductive, now grated. Her influence at court, once fresh, now felt overreaching. Her next two pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one reportedly after she witnessed Henry fall during a jousting accident. She had enemies everywhere, and even the king began turning his gaze elsewhere. By 1536, just 3 years after her coronation, Anne was arrested. The charges? Adultery, incest, treason. Her own brother was among the accused. The evidence? Shaky at best. The motivation? Purely political. Her trial was a farce. The verdict had been decided long before the gavel fell. On May 19th, Anne walked to the scaffold in a dark velvet gown, her French hood in place, her expression calm. She delivered a final speech, dignified, graceful, and obedient to the end. She did not blame the king. She did not plead for mercy. And with a single stroke of a French sword, she was gone. But her legacy had just begun. Because the daughter she bore, the child Henry had dismissed, would grow into Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who would shape England's identity for centuries. Anne Boleyn was not simply a queen. She was a movement, a force of intellect, charisma, and disruption wrapped in lace and fire. She rose higher than any Englishwoman had before her, and fell harder than most men could imagine. And in doing so, she rewrote the rules, not just for women, but for the very structure of monarchy itself. Her story is one of ambition, brilliance, and ruin. And it is far from over. Jane Seymour, the soft-spoken queen cloaked in silence and sacrifice, was neither born to dazzle nor raised to reign. And yet, in the swirling tempest of Henry VIII's court, she emerged as a steady light in a palace of shadows. She didn't sing like Anne Boleyn, debate like Catherine of Aragon, or spark gossip with every breath. But she had something far rarer: timing, instinct, and the extraordinary ability to survive. Born around 1508 at the family estate of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, Jane came from solid, respectable noble stock. Her father, Sir John Seymour, had served Henry VII and Henry VIII with distinction. Her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, was known for her gentle wisdom and was descended from Edward III, lending Jane a faint glimmer of Plantagenet blood, royally useful, if not particularly prestigious. Jane was one of 10 children, raised in a household where virtue, modesty, and obedience weren't just encouraged, they were enforced like royal edicts. Unlike her flashier peers, Jane wasn't educated in Latin, theology, or politics. She didn't attend glittering foreign courts or flirt in French. Her skills were domestic, needlework, household management, and the quiet resilience required to exist in the background of powerful men. But don't mistake simplicity for weakness. Jane Seymour possessed a quiet cunning, a soft strength. In a court teeming with ambition, schemers, and spies, she understood that silence could be a weapon, and timing a shield. She wasn't the storm. She was the stillness before it. Jane began her court life as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon and later to Anne Boleyn, which meant she had a front-row seat to the brutal unraveling of two royal marriages. She watched as Catherine, devout and dignified, was pushed aside after decades of loyalty. She saw Anne rise like a phoenix, then plummet just as quickly, consumed by the very fire she had wielded. And Jane? She waited. She moved through court like mist, never too bold, never too invisible. She allowed herself to be noticed, but never courted. And when the king's gaze finally fell upon her, she responded not with seduction, but with serenity. Henry, still mourning Anne's inability to give him a son and increasingly disillusioned by her defiance, saw in Jane the exact opposite. She was quiet where Anne was loud, submissive where Anne was fierce. She did not argue, did not push, she offered peace. For a king grown tired of turbulence, that was intoxicating. Jane's family, particularly her ambitious brothers Edward and Thomas, seized the opportunity. They coached her, positioned her, maneuvered her like a chess piece across the royal board. Whether Jane acted with agency or was swept along by family and fate is hard to say. But one thing is certain, she played her part to perfection. She accepted the king's gifts but refused to become his mistress. She claimed she could never give her virtue to a man unless he made her his wife. It was a shrewd echo of Anne Boleyn's earlier tactic, but executed with a gentler edge. Where Anne's resistance had been fiery and calculated, Jane seemed almost reluctant, as if decency itself demanded her distance. By May 1536, Anne Boleyn was dead, executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Just 11 days later, Jane Seymour became Henry's third wife. No grand delay. No extended mourning. Just a swift pivot from executioner to bridegroom. As queen, Jane was a breath of still air in a court that had forgotten how to be quiet. She reinstated old traditions, brought back displaced courtiers from Catherine's time, and distanced herself from Anne's legacy. She tread carefully, speaking little, acting cautiously, and doing exactly what was expected, nothing more, nothing less. But beneath that restraint, Jane was not without influence. She made one major political request, the reconciliation of Henry with his daughter Mary. Declared illegitimate after Catherine's fall, Mary had been sidelined and humiliated. Jane advocated for her return, not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. Her gentle persistence worked. Mary was welcomed back to court, if not fully restored in the line of succession. It was a rare moment of compassion and triumph. But Jane's legacy would hinge not on diplomacy or courtly kindness, but on childbirth. In 1537, after more than a year of mounting pressure and high expectations, Jane Seymour became pregnant. The entire kingdom held its breath. Henry, obsessed with securing his dynasty, watched her every step. Advisors prepared for celebration. Courtiers prayed. And Jane, calm and composed, carried the hopes of a nation in her womb. The labor lasted 2 agonizing days and nights. Jane endured it with the quiet endurance that defined her reign. And finally, she delivered what no queen before her had managed, a healthy, legitimate male heir. The baby was named Edward VI, the future King of England. The court erupted in celebration. Bells rang across the realm. Bonfires lit the streets. England rejoiced, and Henry declared himself fulfilled at last. But joy would not last. Jane, weakened by the brutal labor and likely suffering from puerperal fever, a common, deadly postnatal infection, grew gravely ill. Within 12 days, she was dead. Her passing shocked the court. Even Henry, a man not often given to visible emotion unless it involved rage, was devastated. He wore mourning black for months. He delayed remarrying for years. And he ordered that, when the time came, he be buried beside Jane, the only wife he chose to rest with for eternity. Why? Because Jane had done what the others had not. She gave him a son. She gave him peace. And she died before she could disappoint him. In life, Jane Seymour was a queen of restraint. In death, she became a saint in Henry's memory, immortalized as the perfect wife because she left before the illusion could shatter. History often forgets her beside the fireworks of Anne and the iron dignity of Catherine. She's remembered as dull, passive, a placeholder between louder chapters. But that does her no justice. There is power in silence, grace in stillness. Jane navigated one of history's most perilous courts, not by shouting to be heard, but by listening, waiting, and stepping forward only when the moment was right. She left behind no scandal, no infamy. Only a son and the quiet echo of a queen who survived the crown long enough to fulfill her purpose, but not long enough to suffer from it. And now, dear dreamer, as the fire crackles low and the velvet dusk thickens, another woman waits in the corridor of history. She's no queen of sorrow, nor saint of silence. She came not to suffer, but to win. She arrived with a portrait, married a king, and somehow escaped with her neck, her wealth, and her peace intact. And of Cleves, the wife who beat the odds by simply walking away. And of Cleves, the queen who arrived in a portrait and left with her head, her title, and a better real estate portfolio than most nobles, was a woman who defied the odds not by fighting them, but by gracefully bowing out before the game turned bloody. In a world where royal wives were measured by fertility and obedience, she quietly rewrote the script with wit, survival instinct, and astonishing pragmatism. Our story begins not in the opulent chaos of Henry's England but across the English Channel, in the modest duchy of Cleves, nestled within what we now call Germany. It was the early 1500s, and young Anne, born in 1515 to John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Jülichburg, was being raised far from the flirtation-laced courts of Western Europe. The Cleves court was orderly, pious, and practical, a place where courtship was chaste, behavior modest, and ambitions carefully contained. Unlike her English contemporaries, Anne didn't learn French by whispering sonnets in shadowed halls. She wasn't schooled in the politics of seduction or the doublespeak of court diplomacy. Her education emphasized domestic skills, basic literacy, and the virtues of obedience and humility. Where other princesses danced through marble corridors with calculated grace, and learned how to embroider, manage households, and walk like a duchess without tripping on 30 feet of wool skirts. And yet, fate, ever theatrical, had plans for her. By 1539, Henry VIII had burned through 3 wives, one exiled, one executed, one deceased. He had a son at last, but no queen. He was now nearing 50, overweight, plagued by ulcers, sour-tempered, and desperately alone. England, drifting further from Catholic Rome, was in search of Protestant alliances to bolster its precarious position. The Protestant Duchy of Cleves, neutral and strategically placed in the Holy Roman Empire, looked like an ideal partner. Enter Hans Holbein. Henry, always a bit of a romantic in the most superficial sense, wanted to see what he was buying before signing a royal marriage treaty. So he sent his court painter, Holbein, to Cleves to paint Anne's likeness. Holbein did as he was told, flattering, but not deceiving, and produced a portrait of a calm, regal woman with gentle features and rich attire. Henry saw the painting and declared himself pleased. "She looks agreeable," he likely muttered through roast goose and stale wine. The treaty was signed. The marriage was arranged. And Anne, dutiful daughter of diplomacy, prepared to become Queen of England. She had no idea what she was walking into. And arrived in England in January 1540 to great public anticipation. She spoke little English, was unfamiliar with court customs, and had been raised in a world vastly different from the theatrical circus of Henry's court. Still, she held herself with composure. She wore the right gowns, smiled in the right moments, and did everything expected of her. And then came the infamous surprise meeting. Henry, ever enamored with theatrics and self-indulgent fantasy, decided to disguise himself and visit an incognito, hoping for some spontaneous romantic spark. He burst into her chambers unannounced, dressed as a courtier, expecting recognition and adoration. And, raised in a culture where uninvited men barging into rooms was not only inappropriate but deeply alarming, recoiled in confusion. The encounter, in Henry's eyes, was a disaster. He claimed he felt no attraction to her. "She looks like a Flanders mare," he allegedly scoffed in private, a cruel and enduring insult that said more about his wounded vanity than her appearance. Most historical accounts agree that, and was not unattractive, she was simply not schooled in the coquettish arts Henry expected. She was sincere where he wanted flattery, reserved where he desired performance. But the alliance was too politically important to abandon. The wedding proceeded on January 6, 1540. It was formal, public, and, according to Henry, instantly regrettable. He claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage, citing a lack of desire and personal discomfort. Some historians suspect deeper reasons: his declining health, his insecurities, or the simple fact that he was no longer the virile prince he imagined himself to be. And, for her part, was likely confused and embarrassed. She had followed every instruction, fulfilled every diplomatic expectation, and yet found herself facing rejection from a man who had already broken with Rome and executed a queen. But unlike her predecessors, and did not plead, protest, or panic. She adapted. When Henry, now enamored with the young and flirtatious Catherine Howard, sought an annulment just months after their wedding, and agreed. She stated that the marriage had never been consummated and cited a pre-contract with another noble as grounds. Her reward? A generous settlement, honorary titles, several estates, including the former Bullen residence, and the lifelong title of the king's beloved sister. It was a masterclass in royal judo: sidestep the blade, take the castle. And remained in England for the rest of her life. She lived in comfort, attended royal events, and maintained cordial relationships with Henry's children, particularly Elizabeth, who visited her often. She wore her title like armor and never once attempted to reclaim the throne. She remarried no one, caused no scandals, and stayed very much alive. And perhaps that was her greatest triumph. In a court where queens were often turned into headlines, and became a rare footnote of peace. She outlived Henry. She outlived Catherine Howard. She even outlived Catherine Parr. When she died in 1557, likely in her early 40s, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to be interred there. History tends to skip past Anne of Cleves as the ugly one, the failed queen, the diplomatic mistake between two better-known women. But that's a shallow reading. Anne was wise. She knew when to resist, and more importantly, when not to. She played a dangerous game with grace, avoided scandal, and walked away with her fortune, her title, and her life intact. She didn't give Henry a son. She didn't inspire poetry or provoke religious revolutions. But she did something none of the others quite managed. She survived with her dignity untouched. So now, dear dreamer, as the candlelight flickers and the echoes of laughter fade in palace halls, we approach the next chapter, a sharp, sweet, doomed flame in Henry's stormy sky. Catherine Howard, the girl who danced into danger and didn't live long enough to learn the steps. Catherine Howard, the rose without a thorn, the queen without a future, was barely more than a child when she entered the pages of history, radiant with charm and utterly unprepared for the deadly game she'd been cast into. Her story, unlike the calculated rise of Anne Boleyn or the strategic silence of Jane Seymour, was a brief and blazing comet, brilliant, impulsive, and doomed from the start. She was born around 1523, though records are vague and careless, much like the adults who were supposed to protect her. Catherine was a cousin of Anne Boleyn, linked to the powerful Howard family, though her immediate branch had little wealth or stability. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a noble in name but a failure in function, drowning in debt, lacking political power, and absent for most of her life. Her mother died young, and Catherine was packed off to live under the loose guardianship of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. That household, rowdy, poorly supervised, and filled with other noble wards, was less a finishing school and more a Tudor version of free-range chaos. Amid music lessons and embroidery circles, Catherine encountered flirtation, temptation, and the dangerous attentions of men who saw courtship as conquest. She was still a girl when her name became tangled with those of her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and later, a more serious suitor, Francis Dereham. What began as innocent affection soon drifted into physical intimacy, secrecy, and reputation-risking entanglement. Then came her ascension. In 1540, at around 17 years old, Catherine was appointed lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves. It was there, amid the velvet and whispers of court life, that King Henry VIII first noticed her. He was 50, bloated, ailing, and emotionally exhausted. She was young, vivacious, and effervescent. To Henry, Catherine wasn't just a pretty face, she was a second chance. A return to youth. A breath of summer air in a life filled with cold duty. Within months of annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry married Catherine. She became Queen of England, a teenager seated beside a man old enough to be her grandfather, and dangerous enough to destroy her. At first, she played her part well. She smiled, danced, called Henry her rose without a thorn, a nickname that now echoes with bitter irony. She wore jewels like they were woven into her skin. She hosted parties that revived the glitter of the early Tudor court. She brought color back into the gray shadows of Henry's later reign. But youth is rarely careful. Old secrets, like buried bones, tend to resurface. Francis Dereham, the man from her past, reappeared at court. Whether she appointed him to her household out of fear, sentiment, or obligation is still debated. Worse yet, Catherine began a new affair with Thomas Culpeper, a charming courtier and gentleman of the King's Chamber. Their meetings were arranged in secret with the help of Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. It was reckless, naive, suicidal. Court is a place where rumors sharpen into weapons. Whispers reached Archbishop Cranmer, who informed the king. At first, Henry refused to believe. He wept. He raged. He demanded evidence. And when it came, letters, confessions, testimonies, he shattered. Catherine was arrested, stripped of her title, and imprisoned in Sion Abbey. There, the girl who once danced through the halls of Whitehall spiraled into panic. She screamed. She begged. She descended into madness. When told of her impending execution, she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her chambers so she could rehearse laying her neck upon it. On February 13, 1542, dressed in a black velvet gown, hair unbound, eyes hollowed by terror, Catherine Howard was led to the Tower of London. She was not yet 20 years old. Her final words, though likely lost to time, were said to be a plea for forgiveness and a prayer for her soul. With one stroke, her life, barely lived, was over. Catherine Howard is often remembered as foolish, even flippant. But she was also a victim of neglect, of politics, of a man who wielded power like a blade. She wasn't scheming. She was surviving. And she was punished not just for her mistakes, but for daring to bring joy to a man who could not hold it gently. Where Catherine fell in panic, Catherine Parr rose in patience. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, was not crowned for beauty, nor youth, nor allure. She was chosen because she was brilliant, composed, and, perhaps most importantly, wise enough to keep herself alive. She was the queen who buried the king. Born in 1512, Catherine came from a well-connected noble family. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, had served Henry VII. Her mother, Maud Green, was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon and a woman of great intellect and piety. Catherine inherited her mother's grace, her father's pragmatism, and a deep love of learning. Her early life was shaped by loss and duty. She married twice before Henry ever noticed her, first to a sickly nobleman, Edward Burgh, and then to John Neville, Baron Latimer, a kind but politically troubled widower. In these marriages, Catherine learned how to manage estates, raise stepchildren, and navigate the treacherous tides of noble allegiances. She survived uprisings. She read banned texts. She prayed in both Latin and English. And by the time she was widowed for the second time, she had no intention of marrying again. She wanted peace, solitude, study. But Henry wanted her. By then, he was an aging tyrant, his body bloated with disease, his mood swinging wildly, his leg ulcers festering. Yet he remained king, and when the king proposes, even through gritted teeth and decaying limbs, you say yes. Catherine accepted. In 1543, she became Queen of England, not with trumpets or feasts, but with quiet dread and steady resolve. She knew what had happened to the women before her. She knew the weight of the crown came with sharpened edges. But she stepped into the role with grace and unmatched political instinct. As queen, Catherine Parr was a force of order and intelligence. She helped reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She encouraged education at court. She published books, becoming the first English queen to do so under her own name. She held theological discussions, supported Protestant thinkers, and gently steered the royal household toward reform. But her Protestant sympathies nearly cost her everything. In 1546, conservative courtiers accused her of heresy. A warrant for her arrest was reportedly drafted. Catherine, ever the strategist, threw herself at Henry's feet, claiming that her debates were merely attempts to distract him from his pain and demonstrate her devotion. It worked. The warrant was rescinded. She lived. Again. When Henry died in 1547, bloated and bitter, Catherine Parr was the only wife to survive him. She was finally free. And for a brief moment, it seemed she might find happiness at last. She married Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane, her predecessor, and the man she had loved before Henry claimed her. It should have been a fairy tale. But it wasn't. Seymour was ambitious, reckless, and dangerously fond of young girls, particularly Princess Elizabeth, who lived in their household. Catherine, pregnant at last, watched her new marriage unravel in scandal and suspicion. She gave birth to a daughter in 1548 and died days later of puerperal fever, the same fate that had claimed Jane Seymour. She was just 36. Catherine Parr was not the most glamorous of Henry's wives. Not the most tragic. Not the most scandalous. But she was perhaps the most remarkable. She endured. She influenced. She ruled not with seduction, but with scholarship. Not with ambition, but with intellect. She healed a broken royal family. She modeled a new kind of queen, one who could think, teach, publish, and still survive the weight of a crown. And so ends the story of Henry's 6 queens. 6 women. 6 fates. Divorced. Beheaded. Died. Divorced. Beheaded. Survived. It's a rhyme you've likely heard 100 times. But behind those 6 sharp words are lives full of devotion, betrayal, power, passion, and impossible expectations. They were not just wives. They were warriors in silk, prisoners in palaces, saints, rebels, mothers, martyrs, survivors. Henry VIII reshaped England. But these women reshaped him and history itself. They were not interchangeable. They were not mere footnotes. Each left a mark. Catherine of Aragon, the unwavering queen who ruled with dignity, fought with fire, and never surrendered her title. And Boleyn, the seductive strategist who changed a kingdom's religion and gave birth to one of its greatest rulers. Jane Seymour, the gentle mediator who gave England a prince and died before the court could consume her. And of Cleves, the outsider who played the game, bowed out with grace, and lived to enjoy her winnings. Catherine Howard, the girl who danced into the lion's den and paid the ultimate price for joy. Catherine Parr, the scholar queen who kept her head, her faith, and her voice even as kings fell. And now, dear dreamer, as the final candles flicker and the corridors of time echo with the rustle of forgotten gowns, the queens fade into memory, but their stories remain. Not as shadows of a king, but as the beating heart of an empire.